All right, guys, we're going to give it about 10 more seconds. All right, well, thank you for joining us for the Exit Advisors Small Business Town Hall series. Today, we've got a great subject. It's key risk in buying and selling a business, featured with your very own Al Danto. I hope, just to kick things off, this has been a very interesting 24 hours with the election. I hope you tuned in last week to Gary Cooper's presentation about the potential tax implications with the election, a possible switch of parties in office. And if you missed it, I encourage you to go back and check it out on our website because it's very relevant. And certainly going to have a big impact on business valuations and the nature of transactions and what your tax structure is going to look like going forward. And to that point, it really chimes in on what we do and who we are. We are an M&A advisory firm here in Houston. We focus on the lower middle market and private companies, but we're a little more than that. We don't just focus on the transaction. As you've heard me say many times, we do a great job with the transaction. We build a really top-notch deal team with the best legal. We get guys like Jason Knight in helping with operations and efficiencies, bring in your accounting and your everything for tax oversight. But again, it's not just the transaction; it's everything that leads up to it that gets your business ready, that increases the value of your business, so that when you're ready to go to market, with whether it's 3 months from now or 3 years from now, you're going to go in with a transparent, clear understanding of what your business is worth. You're going to maximize the value of it. You're going to have a streamlined transaction that doesn't, what we're going to be talking about today and also next week, all the things that can catch you up during due diligence or getting ready to sell, those get hashed out to where this is just, the buyer and everyone's happy and it's transparent. So obviously, who that is who we are. I encourage you to reach out if you come across clients who just want to have a conversation. We're an education-based firm. We've got guys like Al, who is a fantastic professor at Rice, who teaches entrepreneurship, business valuation, and acquisition. Al's got a proven track record with this, and I'm so happy to introduce him today. Most of you probably already know him. But I think the thing that I love to say about Al is that he has lived and breathed this from every angle, not only from academia, but in practice, having owned printing business and grown it from scratch, literally from his apartment. If you've seen some of his other slides, from his college apartment all the way to selling to private equity. He's built businesses, he's sold businesses, and now, he's coached other entrepreneurs through this exact process, to where he understands every nook and cranny and what to look for in a transaction, and how to get ready for it. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you, Al, but looking forward to hearing what you had to say today.
Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate it. I appreciate everybody coming out today. Hopefully this is going to be a good break from all the political chaos that's going on, but hopefully we'll get a solution to this here soon. But in the meantime, let's kind of learn about buying and selling a business and some of the key risks. I'll talk about it primarily from a selling standpoint, but from a buying standpoint, really you're just looking at it from the opposite end. And I think a really big part of this whole process is understanding each other's viewpoints, understanding the perception of risk as a business owner and as an outside party looking in. So we'll talk through a lot about that. We're going to talk about real and perceived risk. We're going to talk about how, as a buyer or any type of investor, we have a tendency and really a built-in prejudice of overemphasizing risk that we see. We'll talk through that. I'm going to talk about the bid-ask spread and how it really relates to private sales and private transactions. We're going to talk about the number one risk. I think far and away, this is the biggest risk to both buying and selling a company. We'll talk about how you really can get control of your business. We'll talk a little bit about EOS and traction. And then I'm going to walk through some of the common risks, and I'll open it up for questions and answers. I can't see everybody in there. I like to have things interactive. So if any questions come up as we're going through this, just raise your little hand signal, and Andrew will unmute you and you can ask the question. From the presenter standpoint, I don't see everybody out there, so Andrew can walk through that and let me know if you have a question. But feel free to ask any questions, post them in chat. Certainly get to them at the end. But if you have something that comes up in the middle, don't be afraid to ask. Don't be afraid to ask. These are some pretty, I think, powerful concepts as I look back at my 30 plus years now of really buying and selling companies and building my company and exiting it and everything beyond. So a lot of powerful lessons I hope that are here, and needing clarifications, ask me. So with that, Andrew, we've got a video we want to play, kind of start our discussion on risk. This is the world's highest, although one of my students this term told me that there's actually another one that's been built that's a little bit higher than this, but this is in Macau, and it's the highest bungee jump in the world. So what I want you to think about as we're looking at this, would you do it? Would you do this? And how risky would you perceive this to be? Standing way up there, looking down, looking out. Can only imagine what that must feel like standing up there. Go ahead and raise your hand if you do this. Andrew, let's kind of get
I wonder if the harness is going to break or the line's going to snap.
Robert Peavy would do it. Yeah, sounds like a good Beaumont, East Texas, courageous guy who'd do that. All right, who else said they do it, Andrew? Let's switch back here to my presentation. So raise your hand if you do that. Raise your hand if you wouldn't do that. Kind of get a general count. This is an interesting perception. Actually, when it comes to real risk, it's riskier going to work on any given day. I think this is for a 35-year-old male. Has a greater chance of dying just by getting up and going to work than by bungee jumping. So this perception of risk. So we have these perceptions of risk and fear that are innate to us. Certainly seems a lot riskier and more fearful to bungee cord from the world's highest bungee cord jump than it does to just get up and go to work in the morning. And interestingly, that odds increase 6.7% on your birthday, probably because you're going to go out drinking and celebrating. But in reality, it's riskier just to get up and go to work than it is to bungee cord jump. And if you think about it, there's only, if you're for the engineers that are out there, there's only really a few kind of failure points. And if you over-engineer for all those failure points, it really becomes an engineered ride. And it's just like, dropping off a couple 100-pound, of weights or something from that. And you can engineer it so it's really low odds of failing, and it is. So it's riskier to get up and go into work every morning. So with that in mind, Andrew, I locked up here again. I don't know why I did that.
You keep talking. I'll see if I can pull up your deck and maybe I'll try. But why don't you just keep going for now?
Okay, let me try to do this again. Hang on. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, let me go back. Maybe it came on. For some reason, my slideshow is not working. Can you see that?
Yep. Looks
Okay,
like it.
good. So we're back on. Hopefully we'll continue. Maybe something with that video. So look, when you're looking at buying or selling a business, risk, real or perceived, it's all the same to a buyer. They're going to look at it just like they're going to look at a bungee cord jump. It's going to seem a lot riskier from the outside looking in. So the fundamental key, and if you were with me the last couple of presentations I made, we talked about valuation. Valuation and marketability are increased when risk is decreased. And that risk is real and perceived. So this is my vehicle. I've got a 2012 Ford Explorer. It has 204,500 miles on it. Never a problem. It's never been a problem for me. To me, it's reliable, dependable, no risk when I started up. I've never really had a problem with it. But how would somebody see from the outside looking in if I were to go to sell this? This is what a potential buyer is going to see. They're just going to see risk, just like walking into a used car lot. Despite the fact that to me, this vehicle has 205,000 miles on it, it's never failed me. It's reliable, dependable. Anybody from the outside looking in is going to see this as incredibly risky, right? And this is the exact same way that a potential buyer is going to see a business. So they're going to overemphasize this risk just like a bungee cord jump. In fact, it may not be that risky. It may be something that's reliable and dependable, but they're going to overemphasize this risk. It's human nature. I've talked about this before. I talk a lot about this in my class. It's called the prospect theory. It's lost aversion. So Kahneman and Tversky actually won a Nobel Peace Prize, and they came up with this concept that the fear of losing money or the fear of this risk has more influence over people's decisions and their desire to make money. So because of the pain of loss, we're going to do more to avoid that loss than we are going to gain profits. So from the very nature of looking at from the outside in, we're going to overemphasize risk. So in essence, what that does in a business transaction, right, we devalue it. And what that creates, if you're familiar with a bid ask, everything has a bid ask. Even a publicly traded stock has a bid ask. It's a very, very low spread, and we meet in the middle and we set the market. But when we look at businesses to acquire, right, privately held companies, this bid ask, what the buyer views as value and what the seller views as value, we see these huge differences, these big differences as we go in there. And it's because of this perception of risk. It's a perception that the buyer has looking in and saying, okay, I've got all these risks that I'm taking. And the seller says, look, I've run this business for 20, 30, 40 years. There's no risk in here, right? But and so how do we meet in the middle and how do we bridge this gap? How do we kind of de-emphasize the risk as a buyer, right? And as a seller, we kind of portray this confidence that, hey, it's really not as risky. And there's a couple ways that we do this, but first of all, what's really the biggest real risk for a buyer coming in? The biggest risk, the number one risk, it's execution risk. It's the ability of that new person to come in, that buyer to run the company. We really find my brother told me this. He's a pilot. He's a private pilot, and we were talking, and he said, really, the vast majority of plane crashes are attributed to pilot error or pilot decision. Now, that even means if it comes to mechanical failure because they didn't go through their pre-check routine. They didn't handle the maintenance. They didn't make the right decision. So about 88% of all plane crashes are really attributable to the pilot. And we find that in business as well. The vast majority of businesses actually fail because of the owner or because of the new buyer that comes in. It just doesn't make the right decisions. You may attribute it to loss of customers, but you really didn't go out there and handle customer service right. So as we look from the buy side in buying a company, we say, what's really my greatest risk is look at this. It's me. It's my ability to step in there and make the right decisions and run it. And there's some studies that have been made where it's almost the same as plane crashes. When you really look at this, why do businesses fail? At the end of the day, it's because of the decisions and the mistakes that are made by the business owner as you look at that. So it's really interesting. So how do we work through this? How do we kind of minimize, the dependency on the owner, and how do we really create a money machine? At the end of the day, a buyer that comes in, or to create value in your company, it needs to be a machine. And a really good friend of mine, Dave Linda, had Spaceman clauses. He's a frequent speaker in my class, one of the most popular speakers that I have. And he was an industrial engineer from Northwestern, had his MBA from Northwestern, and bought this little closet company. And he said, my goal as a process engineer was from day one, when a inquiry came in, right? Sales inquiry came in through our marketing efforts, to the time that money came in the bank, it was process driven. And I had nothing to do with it. And that was his goal. He truly built a money machine. And he sold it a couple years ago and had tremendous, he was incredibly popular in the market. He had a lot of buyers looking at this. He had a lot of offers, and he actually ended up selling the company in an all-cash offer for about $100,000 over the retail price that he put on it. And he sold the business to a president of an oilfield service company who really understood quality, and he really understood the value that he had. So this is what he created. He literally created a money machine that took him out of the equation. It really took the owner out of the equation. And at the end of the day, that's the goal and objective of the entrepreneur, to maximize the value and really mitigate this number one risk, which is the owner involvement, the owner decisions that have to be made. So, what are some ways that we can do this? Traction and EOS, Jason Knight, who's one of our advisors, is on our advisory board, is an EOS implementer. There's this process called Traction, and you really develop kind of this operating system and process. So I encourage everyone out there, if you're a business owner, interested in entrepreneurship, want to acquire a company, understand this process of Traction. It's really sweeping the entrepreneurial world. And there's actually private equity groups that are out there, and buyers that will not buy companies until they kind of have this traction in the COS system implemented. And they certainly implement it in all their portfolio companies. So I encourage you, Jason Knight, we invite him to talk about once a month on Traction and EOS. So I invite you to learn more about it. Certainly read the book by Gino Wickman on Traction. Check out Jason Knight, some of his presentations, and learn about the entrepreneurial operating system. Also, the E-Myth. To me, I read this years ago, and it's one of the Bibles for an entrepreneur. If you're going to be an entrepreneur, if you're going to be involved in growing a small business, you want to acquire a small business, you need to understand the E-Myth. And really, the concept of it is that you need to create a business that's a franchise. And all the processes and all the systems and all the controls are a part of you. And you work on the business and not in the business. And what he found out through his work and research, he dedicated his life to this, is that most entrepreneurs are, he said, technicians with an entrepreneurial seizure. So they're really good at doing something. They start a business and they dive right back into doing instead of really managing the business. Here's a little bit more on why small businesses fail. Again, it's almost 98% of the failures stem from this from an owner's decision, right? From not getting set up. So, as we start to move forward in some of these key risks of buying a business and selling a business, just understand at the end of the day that it really comes down to the owner and what he does and sets the company up. Michael Gerber said this, it's absolutely the number one risk in a small business. And he said, if your business depends on you, you don't own a business, you have a job. And it's the worst job in the world because you're working for a lunatic, you're working for yourself. So if you take one thing out of this whole discussion, you take one thing out of today, just take away the fact that you have to remove yourself as the owner from business as much as possible, as much as possible. Dave Lindo talked about when we were going through the selling process during due diligence and even some of the buyers that were still looking at the company. He spent 2 weeks going from, he took his daughter on a tour of colleges, mostly on the West Coast. And he was out of the office the entire, he was making calls from all over. He literally ran his business and went through the selling process and wasn't there. So that's the key objective. So I really encourage you to read more on the E-Myth, read more on EOS, and that's number one. That's number one. And if you're going to come in and you're going to acquire a company, you have to realize that a lot of these risks are going to be perceived risks, just like bungee cord jumping. The key to the success in you taking over a business is really going to boil down to you, the decisions you make and the ability that you have to run and lead that company. So let's look at some of the other common risks that we have. Certainly there are risks within a business that we have. What's a big fear of a buyer coming in? He's worried that, employees are going to leave. Are the employees going to walk out the door once we decide to sell the company or after the sale? So it's a risk that you've got to mitigate. Again, if it's perceived or real, in all my years of doing this, the biggest fear of employees when a new buyer comes in is that they're going to, change everything. They're going to clean house. They're going to get rid of all the employees. They're going to lose their job. The biggest fear of a buyer coming in is that the employers are going to leave. So in reality, they're both perceived fears on both sides, but again, perception is reality. So this is something that has to be addressed. And how do you address that? Certainly you can do non-solicitation agreements, non-compete agreements, but really it's a lot of it is just working through this with the buyer and understanding, who are the key employees, and they've been around a long time, what they like, not like. You can certainly do some incentives and everything, but this is a risk that you've got to get over, and it's a big fear of a buyer looking in. So, what's the next fear? Losing customers. I'm going to come in there, take over, and all the customers are going to leave, right? So certainly businesses that don't have long-term recurring revenue, long-term customers, they're not going to be as valuable as a business that does. So how can you secure some of your customers? How do you keep them on there? Certainly customer satisfaction surveys. Are they happy? Are they content? Can we do any type of recurring revenue? Can we put them to some type of a contract, VIP customer, anything like that, right? And again, as a buyer coming in, you're going to be fearful that these customers are going to leave. Along the line of customers is customer concentration. So if there's a lot of eggs in one basket, there's a lot of customer concentration that's out there. This is going to be both a real, certainly a real and a perceived risk. So if you do have customer concentration, how can you lock them down? How can you pin them in? How can you convince and show the buyer when he's coming in that this customer is not going to leave, right? And if you do, and you are dependent and 80% of your business comes from 20% of your customers, then you know what? You're going to have to realize you're going to have to change that. You're going to have to try to spread this risk out, or you're going to have to accept some type of a lower valuation or less favorable terms, because this can become a real risk, customer concentration. If there's inconsistent performance, right? If you look back and sales are up and down, performance is inconsistent, this is really going to hurt valuations. Again, it's just uncertainty of where the business is going to go. So as you look, it's really important to try to keep that performance up. And how do you do this? Well, certainly if you're within 3 to 5 years of selling, It's doing whatever you can to keep those customers. And if it means maybe coming back and give them some type of reduction in price or something, you want to keep that performance consistent. Or you really want to have a reason for it, right? You want to have a reason, because you show a graph of inconsistent revenues, and that's the first thing that's going to jump out at a potential buyer. And it's going to be again, it can be a real risk, or it can be something that's just a perception. Hey, our sales may go up and down. Certainly in today's world, we've got to get through COVID. COVID's understandable. Are we going to come back out of it as strong as we were before? But inconsistent performance is a risk, both real and perceived. Certainly, any type of declining revenue. If you come to a point and you're selling your company and revenue is declining, that's going to be a really, really big red flag, and you're going to have to get over it. You're going to have to convince the potential buyer of why, or again, you're just going to take a lower valuation. So declining revenues are really big, really big risk. Any type of lack of recurring revenue. So if I can make one emphasis, and the greatest business tip that I ever had was sitting at a Houston Aeros hockey game with Russell Vail, who had sold his company. It was an alarm monitoring business. And I said, Russ, what's the number one thing I can do to increase my value? And he said, get recurring revenue. And I owned a printing company, and we were acquiring printing companies. So how do you get recurring revenue in a printing company? Well, we actually started to look for newsletters, short-run magazines. We had these printing contracts, annual contracts that customers could renew, and we gave them discounted rates. And we really tried to focus on trying to make our revenue stream recurring. And it ultimately resulted in a way higher than average valuation to a private equity group that acquired us. They really liked the fact that we had some partnership software companies. So every time they installed a software program, we got a phone call to supply business forms and printing, invoices, checks, purchase orders, all the paper products that used to come off the old-fashioned printers. But we were able to show that, hey, we had some recurring revenue. We had a steady base. So even if maybe our top line was going up, we had this core base of revenue that repeated every year, and we could go back and show it. So in today's world, subscription bases, fixed fees, anything that can get any type of recurring revenue. Again, it's gonna get over the risk. I think there's a question, Andrew. Jonathan?
Yeah, let me handle the mic. There we go.
Glad Jonathan asked that question. I've been rambling for a while. I don't like to do that. Go ahead, Jonathan.
I think you should be unmuted, Jonathan. If it works, try giving it a shot.
Yeah, now we'll come back to him. Okay, let me go on. Jonathan, if you feel free to ask a question at any time. Another really big risk, and again, oftentimes what I see with business owners, and we're all guilty of it, we just kind of have our way of doing things. And we might not have a lack of obvious systems and processes, right? So we just kind of got a way of doing things. Done it for a long time, and this is really a big challenge and a big problem with a lot of entrepreneurs that start a small business, and they never really stop to just kind of document how they do things. It's just all in everybody's head. And again, that becomes a really big risk, perceived and real. So it's really important to go through, and again, this is what the EOS system is. It really takes a lot of your systems and processes and puts them into something that's understandable. Right? It doesn't have to be anything crazy or real fancy, but just something that's really understandable. What do we do when a sales order comes in? How is it handled? How's the process? How do we quote jobs? And having that, and ideally, when someone from the outside comes in and you say, okay, hey, here's the documents. Now it's certainly can be electronic, but here's a Dropbox, and here's our sales process. Here's our purchasing process. Here's our HR process. You know, one thing in today's world, it's really important to have a COVID process. You know, what's our process for COVID? What's our safety process? Accounts receivable, accounts payable. So having these and really that perception that, man, my house is really in order. When somebody from the outside looks in, it says, you know, I'm really comfortable in looking at all this
Hello?
stuff from the outside. So
Hello?
Yeah, hey, Jonathan, go ahead.
Oh, you can hear? Oh, I didn't know I was going through. I was trying to test this out. Y'all can hear me now?
yeah,
Yes.
hear you fine, Jonathan. How are you doing?
Good. Okay. Wow. All right. Well, I guess I was testing from the crowd. So we were talking about like how to things to look out for within a company or all that. But like there's a previous side of it, the market, and there's the exit side of it and going into the market. So I guess I got a couple questions on the market itself. So for the middle and I guess smaller end of what y'all specialize in, I really don't know enough about that. Like, you'll have to create a market through utilizing business brokers. You create it yourself, kind of like a commercial brokers do. And the other side of it, kind of like I'm kind of tearing this in between more of like traditional services and products and new type venture capital, because I get a lot of people who are actually looking for people to source deals. And you know what? I actually do not know the answer to that. And I know someone who knew how to source deals and was able to create a deal funnel. That's very invaluable to us. A lot of these funds coming up.
Yeah, you know, Jonathan, you know, I teach this in my class that, you know, the number one challenge to finding a small business to acquire, you know, you're talking about from the acquisition side, you know, is how do you find these small businesses, right?
Yeah.
How do you find them and how do you create those deal funnels? So, you know, that could actually be a topic for a future town hall. You know, how do you create deal flows and find these opportunities? So, you know, today's subject is really on, you know, how do we really get our house in order and minimize these risks, and what are the common risks that you're going to look at from both a selling and a buying standpoint that you want to mitigate, right? And you want to get rid of. But, you know, let's say once you get your house really in order and you're ready to go to market, you know, what do you do? And if you're a buyer, right? If you're looking to acquire a company, how do you find these companies? So there's a whole process for creating those funnels. I mean, certainly there's websites that are out there. There's business brokers that are out there. There's referral sources, right? Like CPAs, financial planners, attorneys, banks. And we go looking for these companies and really finding a good company that's really has mitigated a lot of these risks and these processes. So, you know, they're valuable. They're really valuable in the marketplace. And as a potential buyer, when you're out there, you want to be able to find them and have good deal flow coming in and be able to move quickly on them. So you've really got to set up a lot of different funnels. You got to be hunting in a lot of different ways. You know, always check on the internet, working with business brokers, and active. So if you know that you want to buy a small manufacturing company, then you can go out there and generate lists for small manufacturing companies and start to reach out to them directly. You know, when I acquired printing companies, we reached out. We had a mailer that went out about every 90 days to every printing company in Houston and said, hey, if you ever consider selling the business, you know, we're here. You know, we're ones that you want to talk to. So maybe that'd be a good future town hall, Andrew. You know, just generating deal flow on that. So hope that answers your question, Jonathan. And reach out, you know, anytime if you want to talk one-on-one on it. Got a lot of information on that.
Cool. Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jonathan. So again, you know, this lack of processes and controls. You know, another really big, you know, risk is, you know, inaccurate financial statements. People ask me all the time, should I have audited financial statements? I say, yeah. You know, really, I think at the end of the day, if you can check that box and say, you know, our financials are audited or at least reviewed. The main difference between reviewed financials and audited financials, reviewed financials make sure everything is done pretty much according to GAAP, and audited financials make sure and kind of dig through and make sure there's nothing really fraudulent, that, you know, there wasn't any fake invoices created or anything nefarious going on. So you can save a little bit of money and pretty much accomplish the same thing if you have reviewed financials. But one of the biggest problems with small businesses is they just don't have accurate financial statements. They don't have timing issues from the end of the year where they put all the expenses that go against all the revenue in the right time period. They haven't done everything according to GAAP. So it's just critical that you do this. And one thing, here's a huge perceived risk, huge perceived risk. If somebody comes in and they look at your financials and they're out of order, or they really don't match up to your tax returns every year, that magnitude of risk has just jumped in the buyer's mind. They just say, man, I can't trust the financials. What else can I trust? So having your financial house in order is huge, huge. And if you can do reviewed financial, audited financials to check that box, it says, hey, these are credible. They've been certified by an outside party, that they're credible financial statements. So really, really, really important that you do. In today's world, one of the biggest impacts to valuation and one of the biggest risks that's out there is a poor reputation and poor online reviews. This is something that's really crept up in our world in the impact that it really has. It really has. It's just kind of like looking, if we kind of go back to the car, analogy, it's kind of looking at a car and just looking messy and not cleaned up. And I mean, that engine could be solid, but man, if from the outside looking in, it doesn't look good. In the first place, anyone's going to look long before they even pick the phone up and call you is going to be online. So whatever you can do to clean up these online reviews, to take care of them, to have good online reviews. I'm going to kind of come back to the spaceman, Dave Linda example. He had about 310 online reviews, 285 of them were 5-star. And so when potential buyers start looking from the outside in, they got a lot of confidence in him, a whole lot of confidence. And they said, man, it's a good company. It's really an indication. And man, if you look at a company with 2- and 3-star reviews that are out there, and maybe there's just a few bad ones out there because they really haven't put an emphasis on that or haven't had a strategy against building up their online reputation, it's going to really, really impact value. Really impact value. Outdated equipment and technology. Again, a lot of potential sellers, they just try to stop towards the end to put money into CapEx and everything, and they really let their guard down on keeping equipment and technology up. Someone from the outside looking in is going to come in here and say, wow, not only a little perceived risk, but I'm going to probably have to come in here and spend a lot on capital expenditure, CapEx, to get this back into order, get it all back up to date. So do you have to have the latest and greatest? No, but you don't want it to be outdated. So when we acquired printing companies, we'd go through their print shop and we'd look at some of this outdated equipment and say, man, we got to replace this old stuff and everything. So it's really important to go through and make sure that your equipment technology is not really outdated. Something that's just going to have to come in, and someone's going to have to spend a lot of money to replace it. Because if they do, they're probably going to overestimate the cost. It may work for you, it may work fine, but someone coming in the news and saying, man, I'm going to have to spend $100,000 on this, $150,000, get everything updated, put more CapEx in, and they're going to take that out of their cash flow assessment when they're looking at how much cash flow the business is generating. So that's really important. Along the line, if sometimes we see these incredibly flow charted out, I teach at Rice, and the Rice MBAs, man, they can flow chart anything. But someone doesn't want to come in and get overwhelmed by your processes and your systems and your controls. They want something that's pretty understandable. And again, I think this EOS has done a really good job in taking an entrepreneurial smaller business and saying, okay, how can we have understandable processes, something that's not too complex, too crazy, and certainly something no one's going to have to follow with every iteration in it, but just general common processes and systems that are in there. And again, at the end of the day, what all this is about, it's to take this and create this money machine. So it's separate from the owner, separate and apart from the owner. So again, the ultimate goal at the end of the day is say, okay, I get a process that comes in and I got a process that comes out, and that's an order, an inquiry coming in, and cash flow that's coming out at the end of the day. And it's separate. It's separate from me. It's separate from me. It's not all about me. And at the end of the day, we walk through, some of the common risks and common things, but that's the goal. And that's the objective of the business owners, to create this money machine and reduce this risk. So I think we had a few questions come up. I'll go ahead and answer any questions right now. Blake?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Thanks for the presentation. There was something at the beginning that was really interesting. You had a chart that showed that I think 98% of businesses failed or maybe performed poorly due to the actions of the owner. And I guess my main question is, I'd like to read more on that topic. I think, it's kind of like if you sell beef in Houston, but then everybody decides to become vegetarian, I wonder how that plays into this 98% rule. Also because, if it's true that 98% of businesses fail because of the owner, it's like, it almost doesn't matter then what business you buy if it's due to the owner. So I'm just interested in reading more.
So Blake, that's a really interesting question. So I had a guy come out to my class, Nathan Yap, incredible entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur. And he listened to 8 presentations. And the students asked, which one would you invest in? He goes, any of them. I could make them all work. And I wasn't able to find this, but Tom Kraft, who used to teach at Rice, he taught technology entrepreneurship. And he had this chart. And he said, okay, if you give a great entrepreneur, you give a Stephen Jobs, maybe Richard Branson, someone a proven entrepreneur, any business, right? Any business, how many times are they going to be successful? Incredibly high number. You give someone that's not a good entrepreneur, not a good manager, not a good people person, and you give them the greatest idea and the greatest business in the world, how many times are they going to be successful? Right? Not a lot. And the reason why, here's the reason why. Because take your example of selling beef, all right? If you were really good, you were really sharp on this, then you would know the trend and you would understand the trend that was coming down. I sold my business, my printing company, in the late 90s. I sold it because I was walking through the National Beer Wholesalers Conference in Las Vegas. We're a supplier to Anheuser-Busch. I saw one of our business forums on a trade show display with a circle and a line through it, a red circle and a line through it. I walked up and I asked the guy, I said, what is this? What do you have going on? He showed me the very first rudiment electronic signature pad. He goes, we're going to replace all this paper with an electronic document signature form. We're not going to have, and I came back and it was probably the peak of business forums days. I mean, right? People were getting new computers and they were running multi-part forms to the old sprocket fed printers. I made the decision, and when I came back to sell my business, I said, you know what? It's time to get out, and sold the business. And I went and got my MBA at Rice and then started down another road. So that person who doesn't see the vegetarian come in or enters the market when they shouldn't enter the market, it's kind of like what my brother told me on airplanes, right? So an airplane crashes because mechanical failure, whatever happens. Well, if it went through its maintenance, it went through its checkups, it went through its pre-checkup, right? Then it's the decision of the pilot to fly without going through his checkup. So is it mechanical error or is it the fault of the pilot? Now, this conversation I had with my brother that really opened my eye to this was, you know what? It's really the pilot's fault. So you come back to these decisions here, right? And, in my mind, if I ever ran a business, I said, okay, if someone else is successful in this business they're successful in the printing business, they're successful in the restaurant business, and I'm not, then you know what? I'm doing something different than they're doing, right? If I buy a company and I don't identify the risk that maybe they've been losing customers because maybe there's some new technology that's coming out, whose fault is it? I think it's my fault, right? I really do. And motivation, culture, all this stuff, it's controllable by the entrepreneur, right? So I think if you looked at that, and again, this is sourced, and I've seen other things like this, and I think you could blame something maybe on a lawsuit, but if you didn't have the right safety procedures in there, the right policies in there, if you didn't have maybe insurance to cover something, how much of that is the owner? And I really do believe that I know some great entrepreneurs, and they've been successful in whatever they touch because they're good with people, they're good with sales. They understand that, you know what, we got to have a good sales department in here, and we got to have good operations. We got to have good products that come in here, and we got to make this a safe environment. And they get it, and they understand it, and they set up good processes and everything. So, I think it's a really high number when you really start and you kind of go down that, and you start to look at that and doing the autopsy, and you go back at it. And you look at it, right? So
I see. So it's like if you had your printing business and you saw the market going down, and let's say you didn't sell, then and let's say it went down. The idea would be that it would be due to the owner's lack of commitment to pivoting.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
Makes sense.
And here's what happened. I sold that company. We closed at the end of '99, and this company raised $100 million in private equity and debt. They were out of business in 3 to 5 years, right? And when the subject in due diligence, the subject of electronic forms came up, and they said, we're not concerned about electronic forms one bit because no one's going to replace a paper copy, right? So I said, you know what? I think they might. And they said no, and they risked. So that's the reason why they wanted. They were doing forms for American Express and Visa, Home Depot, and man, is that started to shift? So you blame it on the market, yeah, but look, you're the one that made the decision to acquire these companies in that industry when the industry was changing, right? So,
I hear you. Thanks. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And also I see a lot of people that acquire good companies and they make poor decisions. They really do. They'll make a poor decision. I can give you an example of that in the landscape business. I was involved in a landscape transaction, really incredibly smart owner operator, had a high school education, and his workers worked 4 days a week, had Fridays off, right? They didn't grow any of the plants. They bought them out. And he wouldn't do anything that was out in the rural, like the Woodlands, Clear Lake. They were out more towards Katy. Really big private equity group came in and bought them out and said, you know what? We want to have 5-day work weeks. We want to make more money by buying plants. And we're not going to turn down work in the Woodlands, Clear Lake, and these outside areas. Okay. So what happened? So the mostly Hispanic workforce that worked 4 days a week, they worked on their own the other 3 days. So they worked for less money for those 4 days. All right. And the 5th day that he had, if they got rain or something, because, hey, we're going to work a 5th day, we're going to get this work done. It doesn't have to go into next week's schedule. And by not having, by contracting out and buying plants, they didn't worry about a drought condition or problems or issue with the plants. And then by not servicing areas like in the Woodlands and Clear Lake, the biggest problem was you start driving to the Woodlands, it starts raining, you can't do your work, you got to turn around and come back, and you got to go out there the next day, right? So whose fault was that? I think it stems to the to the new buyers that came in there. So yeah, and that's the reason, one of the reasons why I'm spending a lot of time on this, because I think it really is a big factor.
Hey, Al, we got about 10 minutes, and I think we've got 3 or 4 more questions. And I'm going to go in this order: Steve, Sarah, Brent, and Preston. And your mic should be unmuted. So, Steve, if you want to,
I'll answer these quicker, but
Yeah.
I got
Hi,
on my
Al.
soapbox on the other one.
Hey, Al, great presentation. So I'll be quick with my question. So I know you represented a lot of companies through the entire process of the sale, and my
Yeah.
question relates to the later process, later stage of the sale process. So I represent a lot of companies through the letter of intent to closing stage, and after execution of letter of intent, there's a lot of risk of the buyer attempting to renegotiate deal terms. And some buyers actually use that as a strategy. And I'm curious as to, in your experience, what things that you can do to mitigate that risk at that stage.
Yeah, that's a good question. See, it actually came up yesterday in my class. I had a guest speaker in there who was a business broker, and that came up. I think you have to be as transparent as possible up front. Everything. The good, the bad, ugly, everything. And I think really getting everything cleaned up, going through a lot of what we talked about today, so things don't come up later in the process, right? And things that you might try to hide, you might try to change. I think you need to be as transparent as possible. So I think if you go back to this used car scenario, right? I mean, buyer like CarMaxes and stuff, they certify it. They look at everything ahead of time. They don't just throw something out there on the lot and say, hey, come and buy it, buyer beware. But they take care of everything up front and try to get all that out as much as possible. What we recommend to our clients, Steve, they go through a pre-due diligence. They have a lawyer, someone like you come in and look at all their contracts, look at all their agreements. They have a CPA come in and look at all their books. They have someone come in and look at all their processes, all their systems and everything, and you clean it up. And in that way, you catch it early and you have a chance to change it or mitigate it or come out. Buying a business, it does has risks, but I think the buyer needs to know what they are, and they need to know them up front as much as possible. So I think transparency on the front end helps save a lot on the back end. And where we see problems is, something comes up later and say, oh, you didn't mention that before, you didn't say that your 2 production managers were leaving, something like that, right? And so I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah.
Sarah, do you want to ask, or I can read it over them?
I'm happy to ask, Andrew. Thank you. So Al, thank you so much for this. It's always, I always enjoy listening to your presentations. The question I had for you is around the risk of lack of systems and processes. And then you kind of did a really good job of a couple of slides later talking about the fact that your processes can be too complex and too demanding. So how do you find the balance in that? I'm familiar with EOS, but I don't know how you can strike the balance between having way too many systems and processes and then them getting in the way of your agility, or not having enough systems and people not necessarily, or your prospective buyer not necessarily knowing how they're going to run the company.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Sarah. So here, first and foremost, I think the number one, and I want you to take this away, it has to be separate from the owner, right? So the more you separate the business, and that's the magic and really the genius of the E-Myth. It says, as the owner, you want to be separate from the company, right? Mm-hmm. So and then you want to have processes that just obviously you're going to have some human decision making along the way, and nothing's black and white completely, but it should be understandable and not just crazy complex where, okay, this happens and this happens, and you try to catch every permutation of it, right? And over time, if you have good employees in there, people and processes, you have good understandable processes, and then the people can make decisions, is there going, right? So it just can't be overly complex where you're trying to say every iteration is. But, by the time you've run a business for 5, 6 years, or you've seen about most everything that can happen. Certainly there's outliers that can happen. But for the most part, it's, you're repeating. And if you're building a custom product, then yeah, it's the process can be the same, but in that component is how do we custom design this piece of equipment project, right? That might be the thing, but the process itself, when a sales order comes in, who gets it? What do they do? How do they quote it? Where does it go from there? And that walks through, and it's dependent on people and processes, and not the owner. So to me, that's the key takeaway. I think EOS does a good job, because I think with EOS, you're capturing these issues every week. So if there's an outlier, you catch it in your weekly meeting, right? And it's brought to it. And so you can think at that time, do we incorporate this into our process, or was it just kind of an outlier, and what can we learn from it? So I think again, the magic with EOS is I think it's good enough, right? It kind of meets the needs of a small business. It's not too complex.
Thanks.
Yep.
Let's go, Brent.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Al, thanks for doing this every week. Really enjoy it. I'm going to ask a different version of the question I put in the chat, which is effectively, you talked about changing your printing business to a recurring revenue model.
Mm-hmm.
As a buyer, how should we view, not recurring necessarily, but repeat business that's non-contractual in nature?
Yeah.
I.e., the owner says, we've had this customer for 15 years, but there's no contracts, and they claim they're going to stay with the business. As a buyer, how do you look at that, and how do you plan around that?
Well, look, some of that business, it's recurring. It comes in. Is there any reason why you'd lose it, right? Insurance companies are highly valued. A lot of search funds now, I think they're looking at them. They buy recurring revenue. That's what they want to look for. And insurance companies have become popular. You're only good for a year, but most people repeat, right? They repeat, and they give you the opportunity. If you can show that, if you can say, hey, look, of every 100 customers that we've had for the last 10 years, we've kept 80% of them. It's not that for every 100 we've had, we've kept 10% of them, right? So the first thing we look at when we do an analysis is we go back, 5 years, 3 years, and say, okay, what kind of customer turnover have you had? Are you always replacing your customers? I'm going to come back to Dave Lind. I'm going to come back to this closet company. He had an incredible SEO search engine. He could say, okay, he tracked every single one of his prospects. Where did it come from? How did they find them? And where'd they go? He didn't have recurring revenue, but pretty darn sure, every year that he was going to have X number of customers that were going to come in. So you've got to do a little bit of analysis, right? Certainly a little bit of connecting the dots, some intuitiveness. But if you got a customer that's there for 15 years, I'd say it's pretty darn sure they're going to be there the 16th year, unless something's going to change in the industry, right? So that can be as good as recurring revenue as you look at it. Right?
Thank you.
But customer churn is really important. Am I just churning and turning? And if so, what's the cost to acquire new customers?
All right, how about Preston? And then we have one from Dave, and we'll stay on for a few extra minutes to get them done.
Thanks.
Yeah, Al, this is Preston. Thanks for having us.
My
question was about financials. So if you are buying a business that doesn't have audited financials, what are kind of the key items you look at to decide if you need to get audited financials?
Yeah, first of all, what I say, Preston, I've got two kind of rules of thumb. My philosophy is, you let the plumbers do the plumbing. And so when I see a whereas or a therefore, or I read a paragraph and I fall asleep after 10 minutes, I got to read it twice. I call someone like Steve Keston, who's a lawyer, and say, look at it. That's their expertise. And when it comes to accounting and accounting due diligence, I say, get with someone that understands accounting due diligence. And there's some key factors that you're going to see over time. Like I said, year-end and timing issues is a big thing. Really important. But the biggest thing is just get a good accountant. And if books are really messed up, they might have to do a good bit of work to come in there and figure it out, right? But as you build out your team, if you're on the buy side, you have a good attorney, you have a good technical person if it's a technical industry, you have a good accountant, a good due diligence accountant. Not just because you have an accountant doesn't mean they're a good due diligence accountant. You want to have an accountant that's been through a lot of transactions and understands it, right? Sometimes you can say, look, I'm going to have a review done. In private equity groups typically come in there and they say, we're gonna have reviewed financials, and they go through due diligence. That's part of due diligence, right?
Would you buy a company? Would you buy a company without reviewed financials?
Yeah, if I got comfortable with it. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, look, at the end of the day, it's how much cash comes in and how much cash goes out, right?
Yeah.
Like Warren Buffett said, cash is king and all accounting is up for interpretation. So don't get fooled by the accounting, follow the cash flow. How much money is coming in and how much is going out. Maybe it's put into a different bucket, it's allocated into a different bucket. Maybe it's, Again, the biggest problems you run into is I had this sale in December, but I don't recognize the expense till January, and the year December's sales look better, right? But at the end of the day, it's cash. When we bought printing companies way back in the day, sometimes we just had to go through their checking account, we had to go through their bank account. Said, okay, how much came in, how much went out, right? So,
Thanks.
but certainly, if you're a seller, you want to check that box. You want to have reviewed account, reviewed books, and if you're a decent side audited books, makes a big difference. So it gives someone like you a lot more confidence.
All right, and last one, Dave, I think your mic should be ready to go if you want to ask it. This is a really interesting one about C Corps.
Okay.
Oh, you know what? I think Dave might have had to leave. Let me see. Well, Al, I'll read it. So Dave is considering acquiring a small business to facilitate the expansion of his existing business into a new segment of the aviation industry. The target acquisition is a C Corp, and the existing owners want to sell the shares, but he's concerned about the liability from past work. Is it possible to acquire the C Corp but limit the liability from work that predates his acquisition? My first quick answer would be, can you do it as an asset sale? Second point would be, your reps and warranties disclosure in the legal.
My answer to that would be just what I told Preston. I'd call Steve Keston on that one. Steve, maybe you can take a shot at that one.
But yeah, or wouldn't an asset sale resolve all of that?
Andrew, can you hear me?
Yeah, there we go.
Well, sure, but I think the essence of the question is that the seller wants to sell shares because the net tax, after tax take home proceeds are going to be higher because they'll get capital gains treatment on that sale. So that may be the seller's preference, but there are ways to mitigate exposure with respect to any of the liabilities that you assume as a result of buying the equity of the seller. And as you mentioned, there is indemnification, there is escrows, there's there's other methods by which you can reduce your exposure and have remedies in the event that something that occurred prior to the closing results in damage to the company after the closing. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Sorry, my mic got muted, but yeah, it makes sense to me. Al, any thoughts? Any closing remarks there?
No. Again, obviously you want to get with a good attorney anytime it comes down to reps and warranties, and a stock sale versus certainly with an asset sale, there's more protection, right? But stock sale can get a little bit more complicated from a legality standpoint. But stock sale would typically benefit the seller from a tax standpoint. Although if capital gains changes and go up, then that's a different consideration, right?
Right.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Next week, as a reminder, we're going to have a kind of almost a continuation of this, or an evolution of this. It's how to find hidden risks and due diligence. Should be a great topic next Wednesday. The week after that, I actually have one of my college roommates who's an M&A attorney in Maryland, bringing kind of a different spin to things of how businesses can take on new capital and investment funds from private equity, but not lose control. So keep an eye out for those over the next 2 weeks. And if you have questions in the meantime, reach out to us. Love to keep answering questions for you. And thank you,
Yeah.
Al, for putting this presentation together.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Have a good one.
Thanks, everybody.